Hi guys, this is Hannah and Daniel from the Sagger Historical Channel. Today
Hello.
we're here to talk with you about the biblical story of David and Goliath and the analogies to different conflicts in history and today. So if you like content like this, please push the like and subscribe button below. And with that being said, let's get started. So in the Bible, David was a Jewish hero and Goliath was a feared giant from the Philistine camp. Just a side note, Philistine is not related to the word Palestine, which was coined many years later by the Emperor Hadrian. So every side wants to be labeled as David and not as Goliath. What do you guys think about that? Comment below if you have any thoughts and we'll get to you. So Mr. Wenzel, tell me what you think about that.
Well, I think that indeed a very good marketing strategy of any political or ethnic group is to brand yourself as a David. Everybody wants to be a David who is being a victim, and Goliath is a big ogre that is hurting you. And often it happens that there is a victim class or victim group that is being stomped upon by some much bigger foe. For example, in the old days, it used to be the Jews of Europe were the David. Then when Israel was created, it was a David because it was a small country of 2 million people attacked by 100 million strong world of the Arabs. There was many other Davids. Poland was often a David because it was trying to defend its independence from a much bigger Russian Empire and from the Germans. Nowadays, Ukraine is clearly a David being attacked by the big Goliath. Also there is other countries and peoples who purposely position themselves as Davids because they know it works well. Even in the example here of the Arabs who were the Goliath, they figured out that to become a David, you have to make yourself look smaller. So they separated out a much smaller group of the Arab nation called Palestinians, which was numerically about equal to the Jews, but as far as preparation for war and organizational skills, they were much weaker. So suddenly Israel, from the David, Arabs managed to turn the tables on it, and Israel is the Goliath, and the Palestinians, the newly minted around 1955 Palestinians, became the David. And it's a very effective procedure or thing that they did. And now people, the whole world, sees Palestinians as the Davids, and the big Israel or the strong Israel as the Goliath. So that's kind of a most visible and notable case of David versus Goliath in the modern world. But in case of Ukrainians, it's really that they are the David. They are a much smaller nation. David is not just much smaller and weaker, but David is also the guy in the Bible that through cleverness and wit manages to outgun and beat the bigger guy. David used the sling, which Goliath didn't have. Goliath had a big sword, and David just shot a rock and killed Goliath. Nowadays, for example, Ukrainians are also moving much faster. They have better logistics than the Russians. And Russians are the lumbering giant that keeps on moving forward with very bad logistics and just thrashing about, killing civilians and just destroying cities without being able to hit what they really try to hit, which is the Ukrainian military, which is more nimble and faster and more effective. So despite having a much smaller army, Ukrainians are able to hold their own and even score major victories, like especially in Kiev and lately around Kharkiv. they just pushed the Russians away from both of those key cities. So David is the guy that's not just smaller, but very effective in his defense.
Yeah, very interesting, the analogy to the Ukraine war going on today. Mr. Bunso, I'd like to hear more about what you think about Israel vis-a-vis the Arab world, being that you kind of touched on that at one point, Israel was clearly viewed as the David, and now in a lot of ways, vis-a-vis the Palestinians especially, but also the Arab world, Israel is actually seen as the Goliath with a very robust economy, superior military technology. So the tables have really turned, and I would say that there's a new type of warfare now going on today, which is like the fight for legitimacy, a sort of lawfare that that makes this labeling yourself as David very, very effective. So I wonder what you have to say about that.
Lawfare is just part of it. You basically sue the other guy, the implication being that you are morally right. But the war between the Arabs and the Jews in Palestine has been going on for over 100 years. It started when the first Jews started immigrating to a territory of today's Israel and Jordan and West Bank. Those areas were pretty empty at that time in late 19th century. Not too many people lived there. There were some Jews. There were a little bit more Arabs. There were a lot of Bedouins living there. The country was ruled by the Turks. So Turks brought some people from the Caucasus, and there were some other tribes. But the area was pretty empty. And little by little, Jews started building communities. They were pretty effective in building workplaces for people, mainly in agriculture at first, and some artisan functions. But there was some conflict between the Arabs and the Jews, and the rulers, the Turks. After 1920, the Turks were replaced by the British, who ruled Palestine, and British later on divided Palestine into Jordan and the Jewish homeland. So it's a long history. But in 1948, when Israel was created, it was clearly a David. It was a small country without much of functioning economy, way, way smaller than the Arab world, which numerically was at least 50 times more numerous than the Jews. Jews at first was like 700,000 people, if I'm not mistaken. The big Jewish immigration boosted that quickly to about 2 million, but still the Arab world was well over 100 million people. And first wars in 1947-48 between the Arab world and the Jews was typical David versus Goliath. The numerical advantage of the Arab armies was overwhelming. But then by the time of the Second War, which was 1956, Israel already had a functioning army, well-organized army, although numerically it was smaller, still much smaller, but in 56, they had powerful allies, France and England. So it's hard to talk about 1956 Israel being a David. If anything, they basically managed to beat Egyptians together with the help of British and French. Then the big superpowers stepped in, Soviet Union and United States, actually in unison. They opposed the Israeli-French-British alliance. Those are not very known facts. But after 56, there was a war in 1967, known as a Six-Day War. In the interim, there was a lot of cross-border fighting, incursions. First, Arabs had upper hand because they were the first to go on the attack. Then Jews developed an effective defense against that. And the next big war was 1967, Six-Day War, where at first it looked like Israel was the David. It was much smaller countries, and the Arabs were beating the drum of war, and they wanted to destroy the Arabs, the Jews. Famously, they said that they are going to throw Jews into the sea, that they are going to just destroy the Israeli nation. Then the war started, was preempted actually by the Jews, and it was a great Jewish victory, Israeli victory. After 67, it was pretty clear that on one hand, Israel is not David because it has a bigger economy, very well functioning economy. It's a country that is becoming much richer, whose population is richer than the Arab populations. And there was a very clever move by the Arabs to portray themselves as David by defining a smaller section of their society, just those Arabs that lived in Palestine, as Palestinians. Actually, Palestinian was a name always associated with the Jews before the creation of Israel. And then after Israel was created, the Palestinians, which is the Jews, started calling themselves Israelis. The name Palestinian became not that used anymore. Jews were not using it. And Jewish institutions with the name Palestine changed that name, retired that name. For example, Palestinian Post became Jerusalem Post. There was Palestinian Airlines, Palestinian Philharmonic Orchestra, and all that, all those Jewish organizations, they dropped the name Palestinian. Around 65, it was actually jointly invented a method of redefining the Arabs as Palestinians. They picked up the name that was laying fallow, not used by the Jews, and they said now those Arabs that live in that geographic area are called Palestinians. And from then on, they were actually a much smaller and weaker society than the Israelis, and calling themselves the David really started making sense, because if you define just those Arabs that directly confront Israelis as Palestinians, then that side is a much weaker side. So from Goliath, the Arabs became the Davids. A very clever.
In that respect, we kind of skipped over one major war, which the Sagger Simulator covers, and that's the Yom Kippur War. And I would say that I'm not talking about the Palestinians here, but about Israel vis-a-vis the Arab world. I could see in a lot of ways they were the David in that case, because a lot of people don't know that the Arab world was backed by the Soviet Union, who were supplying them with practically unlimited supply of weapons and equipment, as well as training. And there's thousands of Soviet advisors stationed in Egypt and Syria.
And yeah, huge amount of weapons were supplied, and the battle techniques were introduced by the Soviets into mainly Egypt, but also Syria.
And just one thing though, that the U.S. was supporting Israel, so it was, you could say, a battle between the Soviet Union and their client states, Egypt and Syria, and Israel supported by the United States. However, the United States in the Yom Kippur War in particular was much more interested in maintaining the detente. They had signed the SALT agreements with the Soviet Union. They were not interested actually in Israel having a decisive victory.
Actually, at first, Americans were, I would say, kind of reluctant supporter, and Golda Meir, Prime Minister of Israel, had to do some arm twisting, some vigorous arm twisting of the American side to have
pretty much
Americans supply
going on nuclear alert and making that very clear.
Threats, yes.
Going on nuclear alert.
So by the time Americans started supplying weapons, the war was basically decided in favor of Israel. So American help was very welcome and very much needed. But by October 15th, when those supplies from America started arriving, the war was practically decided in favor of Israel. But that war was definitely, Israel was again the David, and Arabs were the Goliath, because it wasn't Israel versus Palestinians, but Israel versus the whole Arab world.
In the
Arab
Soviet.
world, yeah, Arab world was, first of all, much bigger. Secondly, the whole world was very dependent on Arab oil, and they used effectively that oil as a weapon against the West to disarm the West and prevent any Western countries from supporting
Yes.
Israel. And thirdly, Arab world was also much augmented by the Soviet Union, who were almost a participant in the war. They didn't
I
send
want to
direct.
point out here that they were willing to actually directly get involved when Israel was surrounding the Egyptian Third Army, and the Soviet Union saw that their client states were losing. They were determined to that Egypt not lose very badly, Israel not have a decisive victory.
The Russians
And
were ready to step in. Yes, militarily, they had 7 divisions of troops ready to be landed in Israel to support the Arabs in case the Third Army, Egyptian army, would be forced to capitulate. So definitely Russians were ready to go. And at that point, Americans were pretty determined to stop the Russians from entering the war, and were very decisive in preventing any direct Soviet involvement in that war.
very interesting.
I would
So
just mention
go
that
ahead.
in the game Sagger, that option is actually implemented, and the player may force the Third Army to surrender and see what happens with the Russian intervention. So the game, which is basically the simulator, is what would happen if kind of product, and what would happen if the third army was forced to surrender. How would Soviet Union react to that, and how would America react to that, and what would happen on the battlefield if the history went that way.
It's very interesting. I would like to see that play out. So I hope you guys all enjoyed this video. Don't forget to subscribe below to receive notifications about our next clips. And by the way, we also have a great newsletter where you can get some interesting content about the Yom Kippur War, the Sagger Simulator, how it affected people, politics, and diplomacy. So see you guys next time.
Thank you very much. See you guys.